Tonight's speaker, I'm really pleased to welcome Linda Docherty. She is Associate Professor of Art History Emerita at Bowdoin College, a specialist in American art and criticism to 1945, who has published on art and national identity, art and spirituality, portraiture, images of women, hence our topic here, Winslow Homer and Isabella Stewart Gardner. Her classes at Bowdoin included survey courses on American art and 19th century European art, as well as seminars on the world of Isabella Stewart Gardner, art and religion in American culture, Americans abroad, and my personal favorite, picture nature. It's a great class. Full disclosure, Linda was my art history advisor at Bowdoin and remains a dear and valued colleague today. Her classes at Bowdoin were the best, I think. They were my favorites, and testament to her skill as a professor. They all started at 8 a.m., and those classes were full. And I think college students in 8 a.m. classes don't always mix, and so right there, you know, like this was a great experience. I'm really excited to have the chance to listen to another of her lectures, so we're really happy to have her tonight, and I think you're all in for a treat too. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah. Well, they always smelled so fresh at 8 o'clock. You know, they had all showered, and it was just like a sea of perfume, but they were sometimes dozing off. Anyways, I'm happy to be here this evening to talk about this portrait of Sarah Chambers, which is a new acquisition for the Yarmouth History Center. And one of the best parts about this project has been collaborating again with Katie, who, as she told you, was my student, and I would add that she was a star honors art history student 25 years ago. She's really doing exciting work at the Historical Center. I've gotten to see a little bit of it, and I can see that she hasn't lost her touch. She's only gotten better. But tonight, what I want to do is set this portrait of Sarah Chambers in a historical and art historical context. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by giving you some background on American portraiture from the 17th to the 19th centuries, and then explain how paintings of children specifically were viewed and valued. I will then show how this art form became democratized in antebellum New England by itinerant artists who brought culture to rural New England and a rising middle class that aspired to gentility. Turning then to the portrait, I will tell you what we know about it, explicate its typical and atypical aspects, and in the process raise some questions that it poses. And I hope you will leave seeing the painting as both a charming work of art and an intriguing one worthy of further study. So to begin, the earliest paintings in colonial New England were portraits, inspired by a venerable British tradition and in keeping with Protestant opposition to religious imagery. These companion portraits of John Freake and Elizabeth Freake and baby Mary, which were done around 1670, document the point at which images of Puritan sobriety gave way to expressions of worldly success. John Freake was a Boston merchant and lawyer, and signs of his social status are everywhere evident in his painted likeness. His long hair sets him apart from the closely cropped Puritan Roundheads, as they were called. His long gloves, lace collar, tufted sleeves, metal buttons, gold ring, and jeweled ornament that he fingers override the solemnity of his dark coat. His wife and child are also elaborately costumed in colorful patterned fabrics, ribbons, and jewels. The red curtain, you can sort of see it hanging behind Elizabeth, is a vestige of British portraiture in the grand manner. The artist who painted the Freake portraits, and we presume it was a man, is unknown to us by name, though his distinctive style with strong lines, flattened space, and patterned surface has led to several other attributions, one of which I'll show you later. Lacking formal academic training, he may also have done decorative painting on furniture and houses. Artists like these were known as limners, taken from the word illuminate. And indeed, their work allows us to see what some of our early forebears looked like, as well as how they wanted us to see them. Painted portraiture in the colonial and federal periods was reserved for elite patrons, a sign of their power and prosperity. Two works by John Singleton Copley, the most accomplished painter in late colonial Boston, exemplify how portraits documented likeness and fashioned identity. While Nicholas Boylston and John Hancock were both wealthy Boston merchants, Copley portrayed them as belonging to different worlds. Boylston appears as a British gentleman at leisure, seated at a table in a sumptuous satin robe and wearing a turban that covers a shaved head, and they shave their heads to accommodate their wigs. In the background, merchant ships symbolize the source of his prosperity, without specifying that it included human cargo. Although Hancock was as wealthy as Boylston and known for his flamboyant style of dress, and as I recall, he had a taste for purple, Copley portrayed him wearing sober, old-fashioned clothes. He sits in an antiquated Queen Anne chair, while Boylston's chair has a stylish Chippendale back. Boylston leans casually on his ledger book, but Hancock is shown at work with quill in hand. This modest, industrious representation aligned with Hancock's radical politics. By downplaying his sitter's material wealth, Copley served his political ambitions. In the early Federal period, a more modest style of portraiture signified rejection of British rule and culture. Gilbert Stuart's companion images of James Bowdoin III and his wife Sarah lack the material trappings of colonial portraits, but represent political affiliation just as effectively. Unlike his Federalist contemporaries in New England, who favored a strong central government and renewed relations with Great Britain, Bowdoin embraced Thomas Jefferson's Republican principles of liberalism, agrarianism, and sympathy with revolutionary France. The high point of James Bowdoin III's life was his appointment as Jefferson's minister to Spain in 1805, an honor referenced by his wife's mantilla, and was also the occasion for these portraits. The classical column behind Sarah signifies their identification with Republican Rome as opposed to Imperial Britain, and Jefferson took many of his ideas, his political ideas, from the ancients. These paintings show that portraiture did not have to be elaborately detailed to signify a sitter's accomplishments and values. From the beginning, portraits of children figured prominently in American art. But while adult portraits were conceived as abstracts of a life, that is, they were synthetic representations of a sitter's appearance, character, and achievement, images of children reflected adult attitudes towards their progeny. In the 17th century, New England Puritans regarded children as bearers of the original sin of Adam and Eve. A parent's role was to redeem them of this inheritance through rigid discipline and often harsh punishment. Little Margaret Gibbs, painted by the freak Gibbs Limner, who did the freak portraits, wears fine clothing that bespeaks her family's wealth. She also has a petulant expression in keeping with her innate depravity. And I will say, I would not want to tangle with Margaret Gibbs. Anyways, a century later, the attitude toward children had changed dramatically, under the influence of European philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. For them, childhood was a state of innocence and malleability, a blank slate waiting to be written on. Joseph Blackburn's double portrait of James Bowdoin III, who we saw as an adult a moment ago, and his sister, Elizabeth, shows the siblings in a natural setting. Their bright eyes and smiling faces suggest receptivity to gentle nurturing. Dressed like little adults, the children hold symbolic objects that anticipate their future gender roles. James's bird represents male freedom, Elizabeth's fruit, female fecundity. For their parents, this painting embodied hope for continuance of the Bowdoin family line. Portraits of children also bespoke parental affection, heightened by awareness of their subject's vulnerability. In 1800, before vaccines and antibiotics, up to 30% of infants died before the age of 1, and 46% before the age of 5. In this touching memorial, Philadelphia artist Charles Willson Peale painted his wife Rachel weeping over the body of their daughter Margaret, who died of smallpox in the first year of her life. This portrait harks back to images of the Virgin Mary mourning the dead Christ. When children died before a likeness had been painted, artists were sometimes called upon to create one posthumously from the corpse. Although Mary and Frances Wilcox look quite lively in this portrait by Joseph Whiting Stock, it was in fact completed after they had died. The siblings' toys lie at their feet, and on the table a book is inscribed, "Remember Me." Mary points heavenward with a knowing look that may have eased the suffering of her grieving parents. While less technically sophisticated than earlier paintings we have seen, Stock's postmortem of Mary and Frances Wilcox illustrates the expansion and democratization of portraiture in the antebellum period. And that's where we'll turn now. By the second quarter of the 19th century, rural New England was undergoing rapid change. Industrial production began to compete economically with agriculture, creating both increased urbanization and a newly prosperous middle class that wanted portraits celebrating their success. This demand was met and in part created by self-taught painters who traveled from town to town. These itinerant artists depicted social gentility and respectability in a language of consumer goods. Charles Bird King's image of an itinerant painter gives us a sense of how this practice worked. Rather than bringing clients to a studio, the artists turned their homes into a workplace. Arrangements were often makeshift. You can see that the canvas rests on a chair rather than an easel, and surrounded by activity of and input from numerous family members. And you can see that the grandmother has a lot of input going on there on the left. In this dark interior filled with plain wood furniture and rough-hewn crockery, a portrait of the matriarch will become a first sign of upward mobility. Erastus Salisbury Field's portrait of the Joseph Moore family epitomizes middle class aspiration in rural New England. After a brief period of training with Samuel F.B. Morse of telegraph fame, Field spent 50 years as an itinerant painter in western New England. In his largest and most complex portrait, Field shows the entire family of Joseph Moore, his neighbors in Ware, Massachusetts. Moore appears seated in a richly furnished parlor with his wife, 2 sons on the right, an orphan niece and nephew on the left. The closed window shades focus our attention on the abundance of consumer goods. In addition to Mrs. Field's lace-trimmed collar and jewelry, we see painted Hitchcock chairs, a veneered mirror and table, and a colorful patterned floor covering. A traveling dentist in the summer and a hatter in the winter, Moore is surrounded by the fruits of his achievement rather than the tools of his trade. He belonged to a rising class of rural professionals who aspired to the gentility of urban elites. Although the linearity, flatness, and decorative painting in the Moore portrait shows the limits of Field's formal training, it amply displays his subject's material success. Itinerant painters could vary their styles and formats to suit a client's taste and pocketbook. 2 portraits by William Matthew Pryor, born in Bath and trained by fellow Maine painter Charles Codman, show the range of one antebellum artist's repertoire. Pryor's depiction of an anonymous girl in a blue dress is smaller, flatter, and less expressive than the well-modeled, spatially complex, and psychologically animated portrait of the 3 Copeland sisters. The artist painted numerous portraits of African Americans, visual proof of Black achievement in New England before the Civil War. So turning now to Sarah Chambers, we have a painting both typical and atypical for its time. The sitter, a young girl around the age of 6, was born in Portland on May 23, 1838, the only child we know of Margaret T. Lane and Thomas B. Chambers. Thomas is listed in the 1837 city directory as a joiner, a skilled woodworker who built furniture and details of houses such as doors and stairs. His business was located between Spring and Gray Street, and the family lived not far away on State Street. When Sarah was only 2, her father died, and his widow and daughter moved to Winter Street, where they lived at different addresses until 1853. In that year, Margaret married Jeremiah Loring III of Yarmouth and moved to 52 West Elm Street here in town, just up the street. We assume that both Sarah and her portrait accompanied Margaret to Yarmouth. No portrait survives of Eliza McLellan Mayall, the woman who painted Sarah Chambers, but we do know something about her family history. Eliza was born in 1822 in Gray, the youngest of 3 daughters of Annie Nancy Hicks and Samuel Mayall. Samuel was an industrial entrepreneur. In 1791, he established the first water-powered woolen mill in North America. He did so by smuggling technological secrets out of England, which led to 2 attempts on his life by British competitors. The first was a hat with needles laced in poison, and the second a box of pistols rigged to go off when it was open. But Samuel was no fool, and he survived both attempts. In 1816, Samuel added an upper mill to the complex to increase production. When he died in 1831, Samuel was an Anna, and Eliza's two sisters, Mary and Fenella, took over operations, building another lower mill, the red building on the right, in 1834. At its peak, the Mayall mill employed 20 people and produced 30,000 yards of woolen cloth in just 1 year. The upper mill burned in 1886, but the lower mill continued to operate until 1902. Today it's been reduced to rubble, and the creek, which powered it, has returned to its original shape. While her mother and sisters ran the mill, Eliza began painting portraits in the 1840s. We don't know how she received technical training, but apparently all three sisters were educated in the arts. As a woman, Eliza never became an itinerant painter, but like her male contemporaries, she found subjects among members of her family. Several paintings attributed to her are currently in private collections, and another of her grandfather is in the Maine Historical Society. Whether Margaret asked Eliza to paint a picture of Sarah, or Eliza solicited the opportunity, the portrait's creation was a family affair. Margaret's mother and Eliza's mother were sisters, making the patron and the artist of this work first cousins. It is possible that Margaret wanted Sarah's portrait as a souvenir of her first marriage, and or that Eliza had personal fondness for her little cousin, 16 years her junior. We may never know for sure, but what we do know is that a portrait of this quality, painted of a woman, by a woman, and for a woman in the antebellum period is something truly special. So before getting into a close analysis of Sarah's portrait, I'd like you to look at it in comparison to some of the other works of the 1840s. And I know we're a small audience, and that will make everybody nervous, but maybe you could tell us what you see that's similar and what you see that's different. Just let it rip. Throw up your hands. And okay, they've got what we call attributes, right? They're holding something. Okay, can we unpack that a little? What are they holding? Flowers, books. You're going to be just like your daughter, an A student. I can see this is excellent. Okay, come on. The rest of you, what else is going on?
In the clothing, It's interesting how they have that swooping neckline.
Right, exactly. These kind of wide necklines, that are decoratively trimmed. Good. Other things. What about some differences?
Almost all are looking straight forward, except that one over there.
This one down here, yeah, she's kind of right. So they're not turned so that they, have to really put their eyes to one side. Yeah, that's a good observation. And Sarah's probably the most, centralized. Other things about it.
Her dress is much more elaborate than the other dresses.
Touchdown. Yes, excellent. Her dress is extremely elaborate.
Extremely elaborate, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll say more about that in a little bit, but that's key. So the style is similar, but the details are much more finely worked. Okay? Sharon?
Well, I know one thing about the primary one. She had to sit still while they were putting her little ring things in.
You mean the sausage curls? Okay.
Ringlets or whatever.
Right. She did have to sit still, and it was a production, and you had to be careful not to burn them off, right? Yeah, exactly. And others have ringlets too. I don't know if they show up that well. Maybe a little later I'll get a closer detail. Well, you are clearly an outstanding class. So this is great. Now let's go on, and I think the big thing we see, the other thing, what about setting?
There's no setting for her.
Okay, there's no setting for her, right. There's a modest setting. You can't see too well in the upper left.
Yeah.
You can see the arm of the chair, but the setting is quite non-existent. Okay, good. But as you pointed out, the work is full of signifiers, and some are traditional and some are more modern. So Sarah's two attributes, a rose and a book, have roots in religious iconography. The rose was a symbol of the Virgin, called a rose without thorns, born without original sin. A sequence of prayers to Mary and the object used to count them is called a rosary. By the 19th century, this most beautiful flower had acquired broader associations with female beauty, purity, and fecundity. In an adult woman's portrait, the number of roses sometimes signified the number of her children. Roses abound in 19th century paintings of young girls. The unnamed sisters on the left hold a small bouquet, while Rosa Haywood's large single flower on the right references her name, Rosa. In both cases, the flowers are nestled in a formulaic cluster of green leaves. Sarah's rose, by contrast, is painted in intricate detail. Blossom and bud are attached to a cut or broken stem with delicately scalloped leaves and tiny thorns. Whether Eliza was looking at a real rose from her garden or a book of botanical illustrations, her precise and skillful rendering bespeaks the close attention she lavished on every aspect of her work. Books, as attributes in female portraits, also have Marian origins. The Virgin, so we're told, was reading a book when the angel Gabriel appeared to announce that through her the Word would be made flesh. In early American portraits, women often hold small devotional books, prayer books, psalters, or Bibles, to indicate their piety. The gold stamp on the leather cover and gilded edges of Sarah's book suggest that it may instead have been a gift book. 19th century gift books were collections of essays, short fiction, and poetry created for and often edited by women. Produced annually at holiday time, they were beautifully bound and often lavishly illustrated. The content ranged from moralistic to sentimental to appropriately entertaining. As an attribute, a gift book indicates that Sarah came from a family of some means. It also speaks to advances in girls' education that began in Massachusetts with Horace Mann's founding of the public school system. His purpose was to standardize education between cities and towns and eventually across states and territories. Common school curriculum focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, the 3 R's, and geography, history, and math, with a strong component of civic and moral instruction. Though women would not gain full access to higher education until after the Civil War, we can assume that Sarah was able to read her book. While Eliza drew on artistic tradition when she painted Sarah's portrait, she also located her sitter firmly in her own time. Hairstyle and clothing were two visible means by which women could and still do assert their fashionability. France was the leader in transatlantic fashion, which was disseminated through printed illustrations. Because styles change quickly, they are very useful for dating works of art. As we have seen, children often appear in portraits as little adults, and Liza's painting falls into this pattern. The long ringlets, the sausage curls that frame and enlarge her face, resemble hairstyles worn by women. While adults, as you can see in this print, had their hair done up decoratively in the back, children were allowed to let their long tresses hang loose. This difference, which you can see, it's a little dark, but you can see it in all 3 portraits. You see the hair in the back coming down, accords with a greater freedom granted to young girls in this period. As girls grew older, their freedom was also limited by fashion, above all, corsets, which they began to wear between the ages of 10 and 12. While early 19th century dresses hung below a bound bust line, mid-century women's fashions featured closely fitted waists and fuller skirts. Even before they were old enough to wear a corset, girls were portrayed wearing the latest styles. 2 dresses from the Metropolitan Museum's Costume Institute show the difference the corseting made. Unlike the straight profile of the French Empire-style gown, the American afternoon dress on your left was designed to fit an artificially shaped hourglass figure. Women's clothing in the 1840s was composed of large quantities of fabric, gathered at the waist by cartridge pleats, these thin, tiny little pleats, and shirred panels. And the shirred panels are where they're gathered, sort of near the waist, at the top part of the dress. So you have rows of this shearing with a horizontal thread cutting across vertical pleats. Unlike though Sarah, let me go back to Sarah. Sorry, was too young to wear a corset. Her dress is in keeping with contemporary style, and as you've noticed, the basic design with wide neckline and decorative trim around the neck and sleeves is seen in other children's portraits of this era. We can assume that Sarah would also have been wearing lace pantalettes had Eliza painted her at full length. Before the invention of the sewing machine in 1846, clothing was sewn by hand. The tiny cartridge pleats at Sarah's waistline could not be made by a machine. And so after 1846, they started making more like box pleats, with broader areas of fabric gathered together. Similarly, shirred panels that created a transition from bust to waistline required equally intricate handwork. Louisa Stock's dress in this double portrait with her brother resembles Sarah's dress in style, but the details have been reduced to pattern. As painted by Eliza, Sarah's dress appears far more naturalistic. And just to do a little sidebar here, you'll notice that the brother, John, in the double portrait, also holds a book. But you can see, first of all, that it's a bigger book, and you can see that it's open with his finger in it as though he's been interrupted from reading. So it's a different kind of book for a boy that serves, not only as a symbol, say, of piety, but also as a representation of what boys were actually expected to do with the books, which was to read them, not just to hold them as symbols. Okay, back to clothing. Okay, Eliza's delicate, descriptive manner of painting does full justice to the elaborateness of Sarah's dress. Whoever made it for her, possibly her mother, chose a pale blue fabric and trimmed it with a variety of white laces. 4 rows of shirring in the center show a seamstress in full command of her needle. The ability to do decorative sewing elevated middle-class women above factory workers, factory workers in New England textile mills. And again, the portrait makes a statement about Sarah's class, as did the gift book. However painted portraits were embellished, the most desired aspect was a truthful likeness. By preserving individual appearance, art served to defy mortality. Though Eliza's composition appears stiff and formal at first glance, her rendering of Sarah's face and form brings the little girl to life. And you will note how the figure is positioned slightly left of center, and the arms at different heights makes them appear just to have moved. The face, with one brow slightly higher, one eye slightly darker, and the center of the mouth skewed slightly to the left, also defies rigid symmetry, which no human face possesses. The specificity with which Eliza rendered Sarah's likeness reflects both loving attention of the artist and the transformation of portraiture in the 1840s. In 1839, the invention of photography would redefine the concept of a truthful likeness. The daguerreotype process, named for French chemist Louis Daguerre, produced single images on highly polished silver-coated copper plates. Photography produced not just truthful likenesses, but perfect ones. It was like magic, like holding a mirror up to life. By the mid-1840s, so-called daguerreotype operators, they didn't call themselves artists, had begun to set up businesses in East Coast cities. Following the pattern established by earlier itinerant painters, some traveled to portable horse-drawn studios to small towns and rural areas, fulfilling and creating demand. Daguerreotyping was a complex process for both artist and subject. Long exposure times forced sitters to hold poses for a minute or more, often aided by a concealed headrest, which would some be attached to a chair. For this reason, early photographic portraits often appear serious and stiff. Yet daguerreotypes and their successors, tintypes and ambrotypes, were produced more quickly and more cheaply than painted portraits, qualities which, along with their increased verisimilitude, broaden their appeal. By the next decade, the demand for daguerreotypes had exploded. In Massachusetts alone, over 400,000 were produced in 1855. Artists and photographers worked in dialogue with one another in the early years. Some painters also learned how to make daguerreotypes. Photographers, in turn, borrowed forms, motifs, and color from painting. And so you can see in this group the postmortem portrait up on the left, surrounded by flowers that are painted in. On the lower left, you see the young girl again holding the flowers, an attribute. On the top right, you have a hand-colored daguerreotype of a little child, and you can see she's probably definitely wearing a headrest. But as technology improved, daguerreotyping became more versatile and experimental, and even a pet donkey got into the picture. While Eliza's portrait of Sarah has numerous similarities to contemporary painting, the direct gaze, frontal pose, facial specificity, and plain background more closely resemble early photography. It forces us to wonder, this is the big question, whether Eliza painted exclusively from life with artistic precedent in mind, or whether she was aided by the new technology. In either case, her work stands at a crossroads in the history of American portraiture. Unlike the subjects of countless daguerreotypes, however, Sarah is known to us by name. So what happened to Sarah Chambers, Eliza Mayall, and Margaret Chambers Lane, the three women who made this fascinating portrait come to be? Sarah married George Johnson, a Danish immigrant whom she met through her aunt and uncle, Olive Aurelia Lane and Captain Samuel Bucknam. Johnson had served as a cabin boy on one of Bucknam's ships and later came to live with them in Yarmouth. The 1860s census shows the newlyweds living at the Loring's house, that was, you remember, Sarah's mother, on West Elm Street. In 1862, Sarah gave birth to their first child, who died at the age of 3 months and was buried in the Baptist cemetery. She and George subsequently left Maine for California, where a daughter, Bert, was born in 1869. Sarah died in 1894 at the age of 56. Eliza was less fortunate. She married a man named Ezra T. Williams and died shortly after childbirth in 1849. At 27, her life and artistic ambition came to an abrupt end. Margaret lived with her second husband in Yarmouth until her death in 1865. At that time, the portrait of Sarah was passed on to her sister, Olive, who had introduced Sarah to her husband. For a while, it hung in the home of Olive's daughter, Abby, and son-in-law, Captain Alfred T. Small, also on West Elm Street. The portrait was cared for in succeeding generations until now, an extraordinary 180 years after it was painted, it has returned to its original home in Yarmouth. The preservation of Sarah's portrait and the generosity of her family is nothing short of remarkable. They have given Yarmouth History Center an opportunity to ask and try to answer more questions about a lovely and provocative work of art and the three women who collaborated on its creation. There are many avenues by which we may discover more. I urge you to return to the painting, and it's in the new exhibition again and again this summer, and share with Katie and your team your perceptions and perhaps discoveries. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. Questions, thoughts? Don't be shy. What do you think about the photographic comparison?
What happened to the little boys?
What, in portraiture?
Yeah, were they like the women too, or just?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, beginning like in the late 18th, 19th century, men's clothes generally are much more solemn. I mean, and women become sort of the decorative objects, and this, of course, goes on today. Men are in black suits and women are in, whatever they're in. But so boys, in terms of clothing, would be more sober, although they would, again, imitate their fathers in terms of cravats and, details of ruffled cuffs and things like that. The boys, however, have much more exciting attributes than the girls, just because a boy's life was open to more possibilities. So let me go back quickly to them. Let's see if I can get one. Well, even well, first of all, in the Moore family, you see the boy on the right. Again, he's got one of those larger books, not the little devotional book, but a larger book that suggests education, the kind of education that might lead him off to business or law or something like that. And the little boy on the left, he's got sort of drumsticks, that or a toy that a little boy loves. Whereas the girl, you see the little girl on the other side of the mother, she's got a rose. So, or you go back to Jane Bowdoin III's little birds, they could fly free. So a lot of boys, the attributes of boys, the symbols of boys, and the things of boys play really sets them up to be more active in a public social sphere, more powerful in a way. And women were they were the custodians of the home. I mean, that's no question. In the 18th century, there was a whole, women's education, I don't want to get, carried away, but women's education was really designed for centuries as a means of, they needed education in order to raise what we would call liberty-loving sons, to raise sons who become the leaders of the next generation, So women didn't need education for themselves, for their own enrichment, improvement, accomplishment, but they needed it to train their boys. And so they didn't need too much of it, but they needed enough of it. And in the early antebellum period, which is where we are now, with this portrait, there was sort of this subject was beginning to be debated, but there was a notion that men and women lived in separate spheres. Men lived in the outer world, the public world. Women were the so-called angels of the home. And people like, Catherine Beecher wrote about that, and she admired the idea of women having this kind of power in their domestic sphere. But other people, like the, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, they thought, no, women should have equal rights and liberties and so forth. So this was being debated in the 1840s, but, progress didn't really, it's still going on, let's put it this way. So the boys are important. They're definitely important, but they're more geared towards the present, the outside world, the world of accomplishment, whereas, you have women, little girls, carrying symbols associated with the Virgin Mary. No.
Why is it that all the portraits forever, until they started taking photographs, I believe, everyone is somber?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of question about that. With the photographs, it probably has something to do with the fact that they had to hold still for so long, But you don't see people smiling in 19th century work, and some people think it's because they had bad teeth. I think everybody had bad teeth, but I think that's. I don't know if I totally buy that because I think that if first of all, if everybody had them, who would have been self-conscious about them, right? But also, I don't think they had the sense that they weren't vain about their appearances in the way that we are today. They weren't comparing themselves to glossy photographs in magazines of.
And it was pretty important to be serious.
Yeah, being serious was was not a bad thing. So I think I've never come across a full explanation of this, just more speculation. But you're absolutely right. Teeth are very hard to paint, too. There's a portrait by John Singer Sargent that he did in Boston in the 1880s of one of his friends, Elizabeth Boyd, and she's laughing. And her mouth's open and her teeth are kind of showing. And because it's Sargent, it's not very detailed, but it's unusual. It's extremely unusual because you didn't see that. And I also think you might consider that these portraits, they were serious business. Because even when you had photographs, that they're kind of, portraits are, as I said, a way to kind of defy mortality. And so I think that you didn't want to capture a fleeting moment of somebody laughing at something, or you wanted to capture a more comprehensive vision of a sitter, and that might involve a more sober expression. But some of this is just my takeaway from it. But it's a very good question and something. Yeah.
Could you say something about Sarah Peel and the Peel family and
Oh, yeah.
women artists
Yeah,
frequently
yeah.
at that time were in artist
Yeah,
families?
yeah. Well, the Peel family is a really interesting family. I showed the picture of Rachel mourning over Margaret's body. And they're based in Philadelphia. They had millions of children. Charles Wilson Peel had 2 wives. The first was Rachel and the second was Hannah. And they had many, many children. He named them all after artists until he kind of ran out of names, and then he started naming them after scientists. So he had Rubens and Rembrandt and Franklin and Linnaeus and all these people. But he also had daughters who learned to paint. And I'm not an authority on Sarah Peel, but so the Peel family, many of them are painters, and they're all kind of working on each other's paintings, and they're working, looking at each other's paintings. So Sarah is one of these artists who's sort of been pulled out of history in recent years, and her work has been separated from that of her brothers. The Peels did portraits, they did still lives, they did some other subject kind of pictures. So, and her name is Sarah Miriam Peel. She's very interesting. The other one is Jane Stewart, the daughter. You may, before I get to Jane, you may want to say something about Sarah Peel, since you're...
Not really. It's just I'm familiar with the fact that women, artists came from families where the male was very prominent artist.
Yeah,
And that's how they did so well. But also, just mentioned Gilbert Stuart's daughter, who did a lot of his painting.
Yeah. She copied a lot of his paintings and so forth, yeah. And I mean, to be an artist's daughter could be very good for a woman because you could get training that way, and even context. But you were always sort of, shall we say, second tier, I guess, in terms of people's eyes, not in terms of what you could achieve. But a lot of these women are being uncovered now. I haven't done research on those individuals personally, but I've done a lot on Stewart, so I know about Jane. And sometimes it's very hard to tell, is it Gilbert or is it his daughter? You can't really tell. So.
With Eliza, you said her sisters were artists as well. Was there any sense that anyone else?
I don't know if they were artists or if they had an arts education, and that's because I took that bit of information from research that somebody did here for Katie. But I would think that in early education, often children were taught to draw. Drawing was part of a common school education. So I think they could have, learned it in that area too. But whether it was formally art training, I think that's probably a bit of a stretch. But you never know. I mean, you never know, who came through. The thing is, with these traveling artists, you never know who came through a town or village and, found an interested pupil and maybe showed them some things. Because paint, I mean, I am no painter, but painting isn't just about, reproducing a likeness. It's about handling your pigments, mixing them, use the technicalities of it are really great. And I mean, Katie and I have been talking about the portrait of Sarah, and it's an interesting work because when you look at it, the figure is really beautifully painted, and you could see that in some of the details. But the background is kind of banged up. So, it's got some pleats and it's got some punctures and things like that. It's not egregious, but it's there. And so, you start to wonder, maybe we can find out, if there was ever any restoration work.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Did they did any restoration?
Yeah, I mean, it would be fantastic to get a conservator to look at that picture and see what was under there. I mean, at one point I was wondering, could there have been more background? But I kind of doubt that, since it isn't really even a full length figure, and that would require a whole different set of skills. But that really black background, that could be a function of the medium she used to mix her paint, that darkened over time. It would just be so amazing, and I don't think it would in any way dispute sort of the significance of this portrait, which, as I say, is really sort of stands at this crossroads between painting and photography, and has elements of both, as well as all this significance in terms of social history. So I think that might be, a next step to think about now that it's come home. And then there's also I'm sure more archival research to do on the families. I can't imagine there isn't. I wrote to Maine Historical Society, and they sent me some information, and they said, if you want to pursue it, they gave me a contact, where I could pay to get more information. But at that point, that wasn't where I was. But, I think you could find out more. And also the family. The donor who gave us this painting, perhaps she knows something about how it passed down through the family. Or perhaps there's a letter or something somewhere in a trunk up in the attic, you never know what you're going to find if you can get to the family. So to have this portrait in the family for 180 years, it blows my mind. There are so many early portraits that, first of all, have unidentified sitters, and this is both paintings and photographs, but also portraits that are just cast aside and the frames are saved to, sell to somebody else. And one reason they're cast aside, of course, is we don't know who they're of and we don't know who they're by. But in this case, we know that. And maybe Sarah Chambers and Eliza Mayall aren't the two most well-known people in the history of antebellum art, but they're there. We know who they are. Yeah.
I couldn't see clearly, but is the painting signed?
I think
Is the painting signed?
the size of it?
No, signed. Signature.
Oh, signed. I'm sorry. Not that I know of.
No, not that I've seen.
But there's the one in the Maine Historical Society is attributed to Eliza, but it's not signed, right?
And I know of another very similar portrait of a young girl in a private collection, also related to Eliza and Sarah, that's very similar, also unsigned. So I think you're right, that there's a lot more to learn.
Katie, you've been holding out on me about the young portrait of the young girl in a private. You weren't that specific.
Working on the owner to bring it in so I can take a look at it.
Oh, bring me something.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And it may be that, Eliza had no need to sign, that she wasn't thinking of herself as an artist who signs his or her work and then sends it off, to a dealer or something like that, that everybody knew who did it. It may not have been such a requisite, but, there's, I don't know what the Yarmouth papers are, if there's any, have you ever been into any of those things?
Yeah.
It's a long time. It's a microfilm headache.
She's on my list now.
Yeah, well, you got a long list, Katie. You got a lot to do. But, you need a team, in a way, to kind of go further. But the portrait's here. And it's not going away, I don't think. So we got, I started off, and when I came to see Katie back in March, and I said, this is an interesting work. Well, pretty soon I was lying awake about Eliza's dress, It just has a way of kind of capturing you because there is so much in what appears at first to be a really kind of simple, straightforward work. And then, doing some of the comparative stuff was interesting because a lot of the comparative pictures are really complex, but they're not as interesting necessarily as the one that you have. So there's a lot to be done, yeah.
Would some of these works have been commissioned intentionally for display in the home?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's really important. And they sometimes talk about, when people say, well, why do people have portraits? There's sort of a notion, well, people wanted portraits of the oldest members of their family because they weren't going to be here forever and they wanted to remember them. So that's something that's, like, for example, James Bowdoin the first, his portrait was painted. I don't think he was dead when he was painted, but he was close to it. And, and he wasn't so interested in having his painted, but his descendants were. And the Bowdoin family, of course, was prospering, becoming more important, wanted to be remembered. But yeah, you think of the British tradition of, sitting in the dining room with all your ancestors, wrapped around you. That's exactly what the Americans are trying to do. Now, a portrait like the Hancock portrait that I showed you, where he's really constructing this kind of, modest identity for a very flamboyant man, to line up with his political ambition, then that's a portrait that probably would have also been seen publicly in some capacities. I'm not sure how. It would certainly have been seen in Hancock's home, but it could have also been displayed at Faneuil Hall or something like that. I haven't traced that history. But people lived with their portraits. And I think this family, Sarah's descendants lived with this portrait. How would it survive so long? People must have known who that, and it's interesting that it appears that the people through whom it descended, the line through whom it descended, is not a direct line, it's her aunt's descendants, So she must have had something more than, just, look at me, I come from an old family. There must have been something sort of more personal feeling about her. And she is quite engaging, So.
Would children's portraits in general be a bit more personal and private? It doesn't seem like he's displaying those as publicly as
you don't think of them as
paterfamilias of the family.
And in terms of where they were hung, that I don't really know about, to tell you the truth. I know that children's portraits were often done of younger children, and the age that was least well served was sort of middle school to high school. They weren't very interesting. But then when they got to the point where they might marry, or they might have an engagement portrait or something like some occasion as they moved into adulthood, then they picked up again. So it's the little ones they want, and I think some of that is just because of the fragility of.
And they were middle school, they're more likely to be around for a while.
But I do know a good bit about the Bowdoin family, and the Bowdoin family. James II, there's three Jameses. First is the patriarch I told you, got painted when he was quite venerable. Then they have James II, who became the governor of Massachusetts, and he was really probably the most accomplished of them. And he was a part of the American Philosophical Society and everything. And then we have James III, who became Jefferson's minister of Spain, but to tell you the truth, he could never fill the footsteps of his father. But the James Bowdoin, they had very few children. It's interesting about the Bowdoins. The first, James Bowdoin I, had two children, a son and a daughter. James Bowdoin II had two children, the little ones I showed you. And James Bowdoin and Sarah, who was his cousin, had no children. So this concern about the family name was huge. I'm getting a little off portraits now. But the significance of children's portraits, there's also a little portrait of James Bowdoin II done as a little boy that was commissioned before the father was painted, James Bowdoin I. So there's this sense of trying to continue the family. Now, Elizabeth Bowdoin, James III's sister, the one who's holding the pear, she loved portraits. She wanted portraits all the time. She married an Englishman and she moved to England, but she's always writing back asking for portraits. She wants to see what her family looks like. And she married, and she had tons of children. But of course, there's a problem. They were Temples and not Bowdoins. So at one point, as James Bowdoin III got to the end of his life, he made a deal with some of his nephews that he would make them his heir if they took the name of Bowdoin. So this is all part of the mix, and maybe we don't think about that quite the same today, but so there's this affective element about children, but also there's this lineage, and particularly in New England, I think it's very, very strong because New England goes back so far, So there's weight on that too. Now, in the 19th century, though, in the 40s, there's also a lot of sentimentality around children too, and I think paintings would have, touched the heart as well as appeared to, appeal to the desire for importance. So. Anyways.
Do you know how much a portrait of a child would typically cost? I guess it depends on the skill of the artist.
I don't know that. I read some figure about. Most of the things I read about cost had to do with what a portrait would cost compared to like a year's labor, And portraits were not cheap, even though by our standards it seems like a small amount of money. So they were comparing them to, what you might do with that money or how one might take to earn that money. But these ones that were done out, off the East Coast centers, they would certainly have been more affordable. And I do know that you would pay according to the size of the canvas. You would pay sometimes about whether or not a hand was included. And I may be conflating. Hands are murder to paint. They're really, really hard to paint. And that place where Sarah's holding that little rose, it's really, it's not an anatomical hand, but it really works like a hand, around that flower. Sarah's not going to get punctured. I mean, there's something about it that it works as how she might really hold a flower. But anyways, so the format's an issue. What should we say? Body parts are included. You also could get portraits that were much cheaper in terms of silhouettes, or drawings of some sort. So there's also other media that affect it. But off the top of my head, I don't have specific details about how much these. And if you maybe are you thinking, do children's portraits cost more than adult portraits? Is that what you were wondering? At all, or
yeah, I mean, it's obviously people spending a lot of money.
I think also it's a function of who's painting it. If John Single Copley is painting your portrait, that's going to be worth a lot more than, with due respect, our buddy Erastus Salisbury Field. Although I really am fond of the Moore family. But the Moore family, I mean, if you look at the father, he's got a birthmark on the side of his face. So even though this painting is, you can see it's distorted, the carpet's slanted, it looks like, they're going to slip down into the foreground. But the father's got this little mark, you can sort of see it by his ear on what is his left side. The artist went to that much effort to include a distinguishing mark. So, But again, Field would certainly not have, he would have gotten more, though, for a group portrait like this than he would have for a single portrait, of which he did many.
You put a lot of effort into the carpet.
Yeah. And those carpets are interesting because I think a lot of them are painted oilcloths, not textile carpets, but maybe oilcloth. I know when I live in a house in Brunswick that was probably from around the 1860s. Okay, and in the living room and dining room, the center of those rooms has this floor with big, wide pine boards, and around the floor are smaller, narrower boards. Okay. And so it was, nowadays we think, those big pine boards, those are great, let's finish those up and show them. But in my era, in the mid-19th century, they weren't quite so popular. They were meant to be covered by a rug. And then the nice wood around, the small, more refined wood around was what would show. Well, anyways, in the dining room, when I got the carpet out, there was still remnants of this painted cloth that had been in the center of that floor. And did I keep it?
I think so.
Yeah.
Or it's stuck on there still, maybe.
Yeah, it adhered to my daughter. She remembers. It adhered to the floor, and so I didn't want to destroy it. And I was going to get it sanded. I'm like, no, don't touch the painted cloth, because by the time I bought the house, pretty much everything that was original to it had been changed. But when I found my oilcloth, oh man, I was so excited. But I hope it's still there. I think it's still there. So, but so I think that could be something like that. This, which would be suitable for this kind of a patron, And we saw him also. There was another one I showed you that had a cloth. I think it was the Joseph Whiting Stock portrait of his children. Am I right about that? Yeah. So he's got something there as well. Every feature, every piece of decorative art in these paintings, Sarah doesn't have a setting, but is a lifetime of research to try to, find out how they were made, where they came from, why they were valued. I just love portraiture, as you can probably tell by now, because I do think it just takes us into these worlds of human life in a way that we still live, but we live with variation, and I think it's a wonderful medium. A lot of people think it's boring, they say portraits aren't paintings, and that kind of thing. But I say phi on them. I think portraits are terrific. They tell us, where we came from. So, anything else?
I just want to thank you, Linda, for this talk, and invite everyone to come see Sarah in the other room. We can go look at Sarah. This is a nice small group, so we can go check her out in person if we can. Yeah,
that's the best part. Okay, well, thank you for coming. You were a star audience, a very select audience, and I appreciate your feedback. I really do. It's always, scary to raise a question among people you don't know and who aren't going to get graded. But you all were wonderful. Thank you for your engagement. I really appreciate it. It makes it nice.